Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Johan Stronkhorst, and I'm just going to have a chat to you about tomatoes and peppers. My role here at Sakata is on the product development side, in the product development team, and we are responsible for a variety of things within the company. Our main purpose is developing and selecting varieties of tomatoes and peppers that would be suitable for different production areas. And we'll get into that a little bit later. It is always a very difficult process to do when selecting a variety for a specific area. And we'll go through a few questions, and I'll tell you a little bit more about how we do it as a company and what we try to achieve with our selection process in order to give the customer the best variety and value for money at the end of the day. So just as an introduction, most of our contact details you will find on the internet, on the website as well. You can see a little bit of the company history, where Sakata started from, also a little bit about the history of Mayford. And the main thing for the tomato production, specifically in South Africa and part of this, in South Africa and Sakata, was that Mayford was an established brand in South Africa with a very good breeding program on tomatoes in South Africa. And Sakata bought that program over specifically for the genetic potential, genetic material, specifically the disease resistances that's currently prevalent in South Africa. And in order for Sakata to expand their breeding programs and incorporate those disease resistances, that's what they did with buying out the Mayford brand and getting that breeding program. And that's a little bit of the history, but that's also the philosophy of Sakata, specifically on the tomatoes. We have various breeding programs all over the world. And we have basically on all continents, we have the breeding programs. And that gives us the opportunity to test our material in different environments and then making selection processes on the different continents under different conditions. And then we have regular meetings together with the breeding team, the product development team, and then we see how we can further advance the selection process of tomatoes, making the varieties more adaptable to different environment, different locations, different growing situations, and also incorporating the disease resistances, as I mentioned in the before. Now, just on tomatoes as a crop, I'm going to focus a little bit only on tomatoes today, with a little bit of emphasis on peppers as well. But the production techniques and the selection process and a lot of the diseases are very similar to tomatoes and peppers. So what I say for tomatoes can be just applied to peppers as well in the selection process. But tomatoes and peppers are part of the same family, the Solanaceae family, and that also goes for the hot peppers or chilies, your brinjals or eggplants, and then also potatoes. So that's why I say a lot of the diseases are similar. The tomato spotted wilt virus, potato virus Y, the bacterial diseases and fungal diseases attack both your tomatoes, peppers, and your brinjals and hot peppers. So as I mentioned, there's several breeding programs all over the world, and we have one here in South Africa as well, which we are very proud of, and we are focusing specifically on the indeterminate salad segment in South Africa, and then we've got a huge breeding effort now on the bacterial wilt, which is becoming, it has been in the past for South Africa, it has been a big problem. But currently it is worldwide. It is a big problem, and we are focusing on that. And there's currently exchange of germplasm, and we're trying to source both from the South Americas and from India we're trying to source new material to look at the different segments, both on the salad or the round types or the fresh market types, and then also what we would like to call is the saladette type. In the past, you can refer to it as jam tomatoes or processing tomatoes. But for Sakata, we focus on the saladette type, which is more elongated, blocky type, but suitable for fresh consumption. Some refer to it as that it does have better eating qualities and cooking qualities than the normal salad tomatoes, but that's a debate for another day. On the back here at the board here, I wrote a statement basically, and I'm just going to read it out. It might not be that visible on the board for you, but I'm going to read it out, and that's basically what I want to talk to you about today. And it's selecting, or the challenge of selecting a variety for a specific area and understanding the basic principles of plant growth and how fertilizers and irrigation affects the production potential of a tomato crop or a pepper crop for that matter. I think that's one of the things that's very difficult in selecting a variety, is it is so sensitive to various aspects, from your irrigation, your fertilizer, the management, the area that you are in. It all affects on the production potential at the end of the day. Yield is one of the questions I get most often asked. What's the yield of your tomato, the potential yield? And it is a question that I actually cannot answer just by not investigating properly every area, your production practices, how you're going to fertilize, all of that. So that's a difficult question to answer, but understanding the basic principles of plant growth, once you can get into those basics, the task of selecting a variety is also much easier. So I'm just gonna, let's first start. The first question that I would normally ask someone if they would ask me for a variety recommendation is, which area are you situated in? That would determine basically your slot in which you can produce, your optimal slot, and which prevalent diseases would be in that area. And then also the humidity, the rainfall, your day-night temperatures, that would all determine the slot in which you can produce tomatoes. Once we've established in which area you are situated, we need to also look at, for instance, fruit qualities that you would want. Do you require, as I said, do you require a round or a fresh market tomato, or do you require a saladette tomato? And that would also determine in which areas you can, or to which markets you can send your fruit. Will you produce tomatoes for your local market, where you do not necessarily require an extended shelf life, but you would require maybe tomato with excellent taste? That would determine basically what varieties we can recommend to you. And then also your distance to the market would also be a factor. And where you're going to sell it. Are you going to sell it on the retail market, where you might require a little bit smaller tomato, or are you going to aim for a specific market on the fresh produce market, for instance, where you would require bigger size? The debate normally, it's difficult also to say which weight class sells the best for tomatoes, because that differs. We've got growers that get a premium price for your large and extra large tomatoes, and then we've got other growers that get a premium for your smaller sizes. I think the key towards looking at yield, looking at profitability, would be your quality of tomatoes. I would say that in the majority of cases, quality sells first. And that goes back to my statement at the beginning of the challenge of selecting a variety and knowing the basic principles. Is looking at a variety, and we can now have a specific area, and I can make a specific variety recommendation for what I believe would be the best variety for your area. But if we do not produce the variety under optimal conditions, and we don't know the basic principles, we cannot reach that optimal quality and yields and plant growth of that variety. And I've been working with a company for quite a while, and I always say to people that we get to name the varieties as well. You will see some of the tomatoes like ST, Jasmine. We get to name the variety as a company internally, but we've got a lot of effort invested in those varieties. And we've walked a long way in developing those varieties. It can take up to 7 years to develop a variety. So the varieties are very dear to us. And it's almost as if it's our children. And we know the potential of that variety. And for a grower to then over-irrigate a crop or not fertilize it correctly, it's something that we'd like to, from a company point of view, make the best recommendations for you to get optimal yields on those varieties. Because if you're successful with those varieties, it means that we are successful in those varieties and we can continue the production. So yeah, the area that you would be in and producing in would be critical as a recommendation. But the other question that we need to ask is, for instance, the production system. Will you be producing in the open field? Will you be able to trellis? What type of trellising systems would you be using? Would you be able to trellis or to prune the variety? And then also, will you be using a net structure or an under protection structure? That would also influence the variety selection. Certain varieties are more suitable for open field production. Others are more suitable for net houses or net structures, but still planting in the soil. Others would be suitable for hydroponics. We would grow under controlled environment, under plastic, in a medium other than soil, for instance, sawdust or coir or any other medium. And that would also influence the variety selection to speak of. So then once we've looked at the area, we've looked at the production system, we can also just look a little bit more on disease. The most critical factor where you would look at disease is either your bacterial diseases, which is soil-borne, and there two diseases come to mind, and that's your bacterial wilt and your bacterial canker that could be present in your soil. Bacterial wilt is a difficult disease to contend with, but we have got resistance in some of our current varieties. And we did see that we have a question on that was posted about varieties with bacterial wilt resistance. We have got in all our segments, in both the indeterminate salad, the determinate salad, and the salad class. Currently we have varieties with bacterial wilt resistance. So that's a disease that we can address with the right variety if we select it. In some areas, the disease pressure is very severe, and you will still get some mortalities or plants that will die under high disease pressure. But with the right variety, you could sustain production under those conditions. The other disease, bacterial canker, is a very difficult disease to contend with. And currently we have one variety by the name of Disco, which is basically a semi-determinate salad that's got intermediate resistance to bacterial canker. But in most areas, once you've got bacterial canker in your soil, we would actually not recommend continuing growing tomatoes there. Rather look for a crop that's not in the same family, and then alternating, and possibly in another 5 or 10 years, you can come back to the same soil and try to produce tomatoes again. The other factor, or the other diseases that would be important to know, is your virus diseases. And specifically, there's 3 virus diseases that's most prevalent in South Africa. Most varieties these days have got variety or resistance towards tomato mosaic virus. And that's a disease that, or a virus that is prevalent in most areas. So that's why we developed varieties on, from our side. We actually don't release any varieties if it hasn't got tomato mosaic virus incorporated as a standard package. That's what we call a basic package. And that's together with your verticilliums, your fusariums, your tomato mosaic virus, and your nematode. That is what we consider a basic package. We will actually not look at varieties and promote varieties if it hasn't at least got those disease resistances. The other 2 viruses worth mentioning is tomato spotted wilt virus, or TSWV, and then also what we call in South Africa is tomato curly stunt virus, and that is the global name is basically tomato yellow leaf curl virus, but we've got a specific strain in South Africa which is different to the other strains of the same, what we can call the tomato yellow leaf curl disease. And we've got a specific strain, and we inoculate and trial all our varieties against the local strain. So once we release a variety, we know that it will hold up to the local strain that we have in South Africa. That's the 2 main varieties. In the past, tomato spotted wilt virus, mostly prevalent towards the south of the country, in the Western Cape, Eastern Cape areas, and then the tomato curly stunt or tomato yellow leaf curl virus were most prevalent in the north of the country. And we used to be able to select varieties according to that. Over the past few years, we have seen that the tomato spotted wilt virus have moved over towards the whole of the country, and it is now not always, but sporadically present towards the north of the country as well. And then the tomato yellow leaf curl virus or curly stunt virus have moved from the north of the country. They've moved down up until the most southern point of South Africa. So these days we cannot make the distinguishment between those 2 viruses in different areas. That's why we also look at varieties that have got both resistance to spotted wilt virus resistance together with the curly stunt virus resistance. That's what we aim for. It's not always possible if you take into the consideration all the other attributes of the tomatoes that we're looking at, but that's what we're aiming for, is to get the biggest disease package together in a variety, but still to maintain your optimal yields, optimal quality, and all of the other characteristics that we would look at in a variety. Just to come back, if you, for instance, look at the different production techniques, either open field or under protection, there's another classification that we do. I mentioned it quickly before, but that's basically your indeterminate varieties or your determinate varieties. Your indeterminate varieties can be grown under protection, under net houses, and in the open field. And that's basically a type of tomato that will continue growing. It doesn't have a set amount of flower clusters, and it will always produce a growing point. As long as you've got favorable conditions for growing tomatoes, you will be basically able to grow tomatoes. Under protection, in a heated environment or in a very stable environment where you've got a prolonged cycle, you can basically produce tomatoes 12 months of the year. The determinate type or segment is a variety with a set amount of clusters that will be formed. And once it reaches that set amount of clusters, it will end in a flower cluster, and it will not produce a growing point anymore. So no matter what you do to that tomato, it's got a specific time slot where it can produce fruit. It's a more concentrated set. And it doesn't grow very tall. So under certain conditions, and under certain production systems, that is your ideal, because you can use slightly shorter poles. There's no need to top the varieties to maintain the fruit size. And it's also, in most cases, it's not necessary to do any pruning on those varieties. So that's an advantage that we would look at. Then, if we've come this far, I think one of the things is we need to look at fruit size as well. You can, to a certain extent, use one variety to achieve your large or extra large fruit size, and then also a little bit smaller fruit size. And that's a lot of the growers would want a variety with a little bit of a variation on your fruit size. That gives you the option to market either in boxes, where the large fruit size goes into boxes and it goes, for instance, to the market or to the local market. And then you've got the smaller fruit where you can pack the 1 kilogram packets and maybe supply the retail segment on that. But that's something that you have to decide beforehand when you decide on a variety, is to see which segment or which fruit size you would want to aim for. Our aim as a seed company, again, is to get varieties with more uniform fruit size. So if we look at, for instance, the indeterminate salad segment, and we go for under protection, we can have varieties with a very small fruit weight range, maybe in the region of 140 or 120 to 140. And then maybe there's another variety that will give you a fruit size of 140 to 160. And then another variety which gives you the larger size, which would go from 160 up to 220. You can manipulate the indeterminate growers to a certain extent with the amount of stems that you have. Normally, we would recommend a plant density of anything from 24,000 plants per hectare under protection, up to 28,000 plants. But that again, if you look at a variety that's got enough vigor, that's one of the characteristics that I must say on the Sakata varieties, is we have very strong root systems and very good vigor on our varieties. So then you can manage to basically half your plant population, but go to 2 stems. And then you can select a slightly larger variety, and with the 2 stems, you can manipulate the fruit size to a certain extent to get a little bit smaller fruit size. So that's another thing that you have to take into consideration in selecting the varieties. Then I think, having said all that, one of the questions that is often asked is, or one of the recommendations is, if you've never grown tomatoes before and you're a first-time grower and you want to start tomatoes, I would grow, for instance, with open field, and I would get a determinate variety. That will enable you to learn the ropes. There's no need, as I said, there's no need to prune the varieties, which is a completely different aspect to tomato growing. And you don't need the tall trellising poles, and you can learn the ropes. And once you learn the ropes with managing the crop as such, you can go over to the indeterminate varieties that in general have a slightly better quality, fruit quality, and possible better shelf life as well. But to start off with the indeterminate variety, for instance, in the open field, it is a challenge to get the optimal yields and to manage the plant to the full benefit of the grower. Just want to coming back to the statement that I have here is I'm just gonna read it again, and then I'm gonna talk a little bit on that. Is the challenge of selecting a variety, tomato variety for a specific area. I think we've addressed the specific area. You need to know what your temperatures is. You need to know what the relevant diseases and the viruses in that area is. And what distance you are from the market, and then you can make certain decisions, and then understanding the basic principles of plant growth. I cannot stress that enough, that a farmer is not someone just that grows tomatoes. A farmer should actually be a little bit of a scientist, and understand what the influence of the sunlight is. What's the influence of your temperature, both your day temperature and your night temperature? What's the influence of your fertilizer, the different nutritional elements? And I'll get to that a little bit later. But we have to know what the role, for instance, is on nitrogen, what the role is of potassium. It's not, I always say it's not rocket science. We have to keep to the basics. But we have to understand certain basics that's needed for plant growth. And we have to understand what influence the different effects that we do as a farmer or a producer have on the crop, and at the end of the day, towards the yield. Just looking at temperatures again, we've looked at the area. We can basically grow tomatoes in any environment that is frost-free. And then your optimal temperatures for growth is in the region of 21 to 24 degrees Celsius, and your night temperatures, the optimal would be anything from 14 to 17, and then your day temperatures between 23 and 26. Now, if I say optimal temperatures for growth, that also includes the pollination. And immediately we can grow tomatoes outside of those temperature ranges. So you don't have to only be, for instance, in the day between 23 and 26. But once you go outside of those temperature ranges, we have to know that we will have some sort of negative effect on specifically on your pollination. If, for instance, you go below night temperatures of 14 and you go into the 8 degrees or 6 degrees, you will not damage the plant substantially, but your pollination will be negatively affected. Once your pollination is affected, negatively affected, it will have a direct influence on your fruit size, for instance. And the same goes for your higher temperatures. As soon as we go over a temperature of 26, and we start going into the 30s and 35s, it's got a direct influence on your pollination, and your fruit size will not be the optimal at what it can be. That's why we try to produce tomatoes in the time slot where it's most favorable. And I think a lot of growers are trying to push the boundaries a little bit. And what they find out is that they make money in a specific time slot, and they have very, very good yields. And then they push the varieties outside of the favorable conditions. And then the plants are more susceptible to disease. You get lower fruit set. Your flowers tend to abort under high temperatures. You get lower pollination, so your fruit size is smaller. And all of a sudden, where you might have a yield potential of 100 tons, all of a sudden, if you do not have the favorable conditions, you end up with a yield of 70 or 60 tons, or 60, 70% of your potential yield. And then it really is problematic for growers. Where we go, tomatoes, normally we recommend that, especially for the hybrids, most of our varieties are hybrids. And the difference between a hybrid and an open pollinated variety is in the breeding efforts that we have. The hybrids, they are much more expensive, but they've got the necessary qualities, and we can define that qualities, as I said, towards specific fruit size, disease resistance, and all of that. The open pollinated varieties is just varieties that have been selected over a number of years and that also grow under different climatic conditions. They've got moderately good disease resistances, but once you look at fruit uniformity, you look at shelf life, we actually recommend that for your commercial growers that we produce hybrid seed. Another aspect towards hybrid production, tomatoes, is we normally recommend that you do seedling productions with a registered seedling nursery. The seed are more expensive, as I said, so you don't want to basically involve yourself in trying to germinate and produce a quality seedling and then continue with the growing. So rather, my recommendation always is use a reputable seedling grower that can give you exactly what you want. And it's important to know, ask different nurseries. Ask if they are registered. For instance, in South Africa, we've got the Seedling Growers Association of South Africa. Ask yourself if they are registered and audited by the Seedling Growers Association. And that gives you a certain level, a standard. Once you order a seedling, you know what type of seedling and what quality of seedling you will get at the end of the day. One of the secrets to tomato production is start off with a good seedling. Once you use a seedling that's disease infected or doesn't have proper root development, there's been trying to hold back or stunt it in a certain way to deliver at a certain stage, or an elongated seedling that has grown too fast under conditions, you just start off on the wrong foot. I know that there's a practice that you can produce a very long seedling, an elongated seedling, and then you transplant it very deep, and then it make roots out of the stems and all of that. For me, I never recommend that. I know that there's guys recommending it, but I never recommend to plant an older seedling or an elongated seedling. What you will see at the end of the day is, yes, there is an abundance of roots forming out of the stem, but those roots are not true roots. And it's almost like having a heart bypass. It's not the same thing. Rather, get a quality seedling where the ratio of your shoots and your roots are in the ideal conditions, and the roots are not pot bound or root bound. It hasn't been damaged, and your leaves at the top, your shoot, hasn't been infected by some sort of disease or attacked by insects. Start off with a proper, good seedling that's been transplanted at the right stage, and then also planted at the correct depth. As soon as you plant a seedling too deep, especially in warmer soils, you run the risk of exposing the stem towards the harder, let's say, rocks or clods in the soil that can damage the stem, and immediately the plant is more susceptible to diseases. If, for instance, you've got a pot-bound or a root-bound seedling, and you pull that out of the seedling tray, or it has been pulled, and you transplant that, the roots are also more exposed to diseases, and that can create problems later in the season. So what you want is a good seedling. Once you put it in the soil, the roots are ready to go, and you can start producing. It doesn't have to overcome basically a stress period where the seedlings first have to spend some time on recovering itself and then start growing. Use a good seedling that wants to grow from day one. Okay, just looking at going further on this, the quote that I put on the board here. If we look at the basic principles, I mentioned the temperature and the humidities. If we look at basically fertilizers and irrigation, I mentioned in the earlier that, for instance, knowing what the role of nitrogen is very critical, especially on tomatoes. And for me, for instance, the over-application of nitrogen is very critical on tomatoes, and that can offset the whole production cycle of the tomato. If you, for instance, have a specific variety that requires a very low initial nitrogen application, and you over-apply nitrogen, then it tends to grow too vegetatively, and it doesn't set flowers. That takes a very long time for a tomato plant to switch over and go into the reproductive phase again to set flowers and to be in balance. Normally, it can take up to 8 weeks to recover and switch over a plant from the vegetative stage to the reproductive stage. And by that time, you've lost a lot of production potential, and you end up with for instance, fruit that, or a plant that only sets fruit at 500 or 600 millimeters, where you ideally want your first cluster to basically to be just above the ground level. That's critical for managing tomatoes. There is, of course, there's difference in varieties, and we have varieties, as I mentioned, that is very susceptible to over-application of nitrogen, and we recommend or we do fertilizer suggestions, and we give you some of the ratios for the application of fertilizer, where you hold back on the nitrogen for at least, let's say, the first 4 to 6 weeks of that plant. You apply very little nitrogen. The plants are, as I mentioned, some of the plants are very vigorous, and they can grow with very little amount of nitrogen. Then there's other varieties, like we have one variety in the Saladette market, which is a well-established variety by the name of Mariana. That variety, for instance, is completely different to a variety like Esti, where with Mariana, we would like to apply a very high fertilizer regime as a start, but at least 60% of the nitrogen needs to be applied within the first 6 weeks of that crop. What that does is we specifically try to offset the fruit set of that variety. Otherwise, we don't have a big enough frame to support the yields the potential yields of that variety. So there we apply nitrogen within the first 6 weeks. We build a nice frame, and then we only start setting fruit. And then it's a very concentrated set with maybe 2 sets that's in subsequent, and then you terminate that crop. But if you do not fertilize the crop initially with high nitrogen levels, you end up with a very small plant or a factory, and it cannot sustain the fruit set. And it sets fruit very early on, but normally your other qualities like your shelf life, your size, all of that is negatively affected. So it is, all the contact details are on the internet. So what you would look for is look at your specific area or country in South Africa or Africa, and contact the local representative and ask him about some of the varieties. And they would also be able to tell you, we've got specific recommendations, and get as much information as possible on varieties and the fertilizer recommendations, and how to manage that variety. And once you've got those recommendations, you can go to your fertilizer representative, and in conjunction with Sakata, we can design a fertilizer program, with the type of products that you would use or the products that's available in your area. But then at least we can do justice to the variety and manage it according to what it needs. I always say that specifically with the fertilizers, apply the fertilizer according to what the plant needs when it needs it. And that's something that I've written on my wall, and I always remember that. You look at the varieties and see when does the plant require what type of fertilizer, if it's nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, or calcium, and apply the nutrients to when that plant needs it for optimal growth, because there is varietal differences in that. I just want to, okay, then another very critical aspect to tomato production, and I often see a lot of mistakes, and the majority of mistakes that we see in tomato production is when it comes to irrigation. Now, there's no golden rule when it comes to irrigation. We have to look at our soil type, firstly, and see, for instance, what is the water holding capacity of the soil. There's no difference. We can produce tomatoes on any soil type. We can produce it on a sandy soil, a loam soil, or a clay soil. We just need to, the key element to tomato production and to irrigation is to drainage. As long as you've got proper drainage and you do not suffocate your feeding roots, which is normally situated in the first 200 millimeters under the soil level. If you do not suffocate that with irrigation, too much water, basically then you can produce tomatoes under any condition. So what I would say is look at the soil type, and then also the best way to determine how much water you need to put on a plant depends on the stage of the plant. There's no use in giving 2 liters an hour or 2 liters per day on a seedling that's just been transplanted. Then you need to look at, I always say, take a shovel or a spade and dig a hole and apply a certain amount of water through your irrigation. Mostly, I recommend drip irrigation, but there are other methods that you can use. We've got growers that do under sprinkler irrigation or pivots, but the majority of tomatoes and the most successful tomato growers do produce under drip irrigation, and that gives us a very uniform distribution of water throughout the profile, and it's got the advantage that you can use the soluble fertilizers to apply exactly what the plant needs when it needs it. So when it gets to the irrigation, dig a hole next to the plants and see where the roots have developed. And if the roots have developed, if you see any limitations, maybe there is some compaction layers, or in a sandy soil there's some clay layer at the bottom, and you see your roots have not penetrated, let's say further than 300 millimeters, there's no use in really irrigating for a soil profile of 600 to 700 millimeters. Then we're just wasting water, and another negative effect would be that we flush out all the nutrients that we have applied. So that's one of the things that I always do, is dig a hole next to your crop, see where the roots are going, and then manage that root zone. The bigger the root zone, the easier it is to manage your crops. I always refer to it as basically as your reservoir. If you have a very large reservoir in which your roots can grow, and then you've got more time. If there's any problems arising, if you cannot irrigate that day, or there's a electricity problem that you cannot pump, or it's an exceptionally hot day, then you've got a larger a reservoir from which your plant can tap into, and it can go over that difficult periods with much more comfort. If you've got a small root system, very limited root system, you need to react very fast. Otherwise, the plant goes into stress, and immediately if the plant goes under stress, you've got a negative effect on your flowers. Your flowers can abort, or you've got problems with the pollination, and immediately that has a negative effect on your yield at the end of the day. Yield at the moment, irrigation at the moment, is one of the most limiting factors. What I see all over, I travel all over the country, and it's one of the most limiting factors where we over irrigate to a large extent. One of the secrets that I've been taught over my career, and I challenge you to have a look at that as well. have a look at the tomato plant, and if a plant starts wilting, it's not necessarily a sign of that there's too little water. Get out of the car, go into the field, dig a hole, and see what's going on in the soil profile. Because a over irrigation symptom and the under irrigation symptom, where we normally associate it with a wilting for under irrigation, over irrigation can give you exactly the same system. So if you do not get out, get your hands dirty, get your knees dirty, dig a hole, you will not be sure of what you really have to do there. And a lot of the time we just open the irrigation and we have a much larger negative effect on our crops. And once the plant is shut down, basically, it becomes more susceptible to disease as well. So that's more or less what I prepared for today. I just want to go. We've got a few questions here. I see that Calvin has asked about shelf life after harvesting. An interesting fact. I don't know how scientific it is, but an interesting fact I heard: never store a tomato in the refrigerator. That's one of the things. It prolongs the theoretically shelf life, but we do not develop the taste. So what I do is, if I've got experiments here and trials that I run, I can take the harvested fruit and I can harvest it basically full maturity, and I can leave it on the shelf, on the desk. Sometimes my colleagues complain that I've got a lot of tomatoes lying around, and I test the shelf life to the maximum limits, but I leave it out in the office on the shelf, and then I've got no problem in reaching a shelf life of 10 days, 10 to 14 days. Not in a refrigerator, just in an open office. One of the things, as I said, I don't know how scientific it is, but someone said store the tomato with the calyx, that's the attachment where the petals are. Store the tomato upside down, and then you'll even get better shelf life on that. But I don't know how scientific that is. Shelf life, it's a very important characteristics that we breed for, and there's different genes involved in giving us extended shelf life as well. One of the most well-known of those genes are, for instance, the RIN gene, which gives us very, very good shelf life. The problem is that for instance, under winter conditions where we have slightly cooler day temperatures, you might have, if the variety has the RIN gene, it might take a very, very long time to ripen up. But then you've got the shelf life. Nowadays, we try to find genes, locate genes that would give us the same type of shelf life than, for instance, the RIN gene, but without the negative effects of the ripening up under cooler conditions. Most of our varieties, we can say, have got at least extended to long life when it comes to shelf life. I must stress that the balance between the two most critical elements would be your nitrogen and your potassium. If that ratio within the fruit is also not optimal, you will not get the benefits of the extended shelf life anyway. So we need to look at the balance between the fertilizers or the elements within the plants and make sure that we've grown the plant under optimal conditions. I've addressed, there was another question here with MOLF, which also, which variety do you have for winter and for long shelf life? And again, for me to make a recommendation just based on a question like that, firstly, we need to ask in which area are you situated? Are you going to produce open field or under protection? Have you grown before? And for winter, would you be able to grow tomatoes in winter conditions? Will it not be too cold? We have varieties, for instance, in the East London area. We have one variety by the name of Kennedy, which we grow under protection. And that variety has got excellent shelf life under summer conditions. We grow it in the summer, And then we've got another new release that we're just introducing into the market by the name of Narine. You will see that on the website pretty soon. But that was developed specifically for winter production, where you can maintain production throughout the whole of the season, winter and summer, with 2 different varieties, both having exceptional shelf life and then maintaining the same type of fruit size. The Narine being slightly bigger genetically than Kennedy, but under winter conditions, slightly cooler conditions, it still gives you, let's say, between 120, 140 gram fruit. And then the Kennedy in summer, exceptional shelf life. If you grow the Kennedy has got the Rin gene. If you grow Kennedy, for instance, in winter conditions, you'll get slightly delayed ripening on the plant, which is a negative aspect, which you do not get with the Narine. Okay, other questions is buying directly from your company. Mostly anyone can, Sakata is a direct distribution in South Africa. So all the contact details are on the website, and you can contact those area representatives, and they can, the benefit of buying through a representative is that they are the local guys, they know the local environment, they spend the time in the area, they know what's planted in the area, they can assist you with various production methods as well, and they are on farm level, so they can visit you and make some recommendations as there. Once it gets to other countries within Africa, we do have distributors in a lot of them, and it is always best to buy through those distributors. And if there's any problems, I know sometimes they don't have all the varieties, but that's what this forum is also for, and the website is for, is to address that we'd like to hear from you and address any queries if there's problems with availability or anything like that. So look at the website, look at the different countries that we supply. Please contact the distributors there. It's much more, it's much easier to distribute through them, because we have to comply with certain import and export regulations, and we have to give the certificates through. So there's a lot of documentation that needs to go with it. So it's not easy to just, for instance, buy a seed in South Africa on the website and then we distribute to any other country. It doesn't, unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Please address it, send the queries through, and we can assist in any way possible. I've got a question here from Roger that just would like to know on red and yellow peppers that he wants to plant in September. Again, the main thing is I would need to know in which area you're situated, and then normally the red and yellow peppers, all peppers start off green and then they either turn red or yellow. We've got varieties that's suitable for that, but that's mostly the red and yellow. It's mostly grown under protection because of as soon as your green pepper starts turning red or yellow, it's very visible to your insects and your birds and other animals, and they normally come and attack that. And if you do not have some sort of protection on the crop, you can lose a lot of money, because once you leave the fruit to turn red or yellow, it starts delaying the fruit set on a pepper plant. So if you produce red or yellow, you will have lower yields, but normally the price on the market compensates for that. But to do a recommendation like that, pepper is also very sensitive to the virus diseases. So we have to look at which area are you situated in. But maybe in later you can contact us again and give us some more information, and we can do some recommendations on that. And then basically the last area, I did address it a little bit, but any tomato hybrids for your tropical areas and with resistance to bacterial wilt. As I said, on Sakata, South Africa have got resistance to bacterial wilt on all our segments. On the indeterminate salad range, we have varieties like the MFH 9343. We've got Rhapsody that's got resistance. On the determinate salad range, we've got Disco, we've got MFH 7032, and we've got a new one for tuna that's also got resistance to bacterial wilt. And then on the saladette side, we have a variety by the name of Legato, which is quite a old variety, but it's still a very good variety when it comes to disease resistance. And then we're launching 2 new varieties in South Africa for your tropical areas. The one is called Emerald, and the other one is will be called Zara. They've both got resistance to bacterial wilt, and we are using that specifically up in Africa as well, East Africa and West Africa, under tropical conditions, and we're getting exceptional results on the disease resistance to bacterial wilt. Yeah, that's it more or less from my side for today. Please, I hope that it was informative for you. But as I say, you're welcome to send in any questions, and we'll try to address it in future sessions like this. And we welcome any of your comments that you have for us. So that's it from my side. And until we meet again, all the best with your tomato growing. Thanks.